How much is a secret worth? For an 85-year-old billionaire who had everything, power, fame, and a name that could move mountains. There was still one thing he couldn't buy: peace. Behind the grand walls of his mansion, he lived with a secret so heavy. It followed him through every success, every sleepless night, every breath. And when his time finally came, he didn't turn to his lawyers nor to his children, but to a 24-year-old nurse. A young woman who owned nothing but a heart full of compassion. She was the only one he trusted, the one he asked to fulfill his final wishes before he closed his eyes forever. What she did next would uncover a truth that money could never hide, a truth that would change her life forever. This is a story about the kind of secrets that wealth can buy, and the kind of truths it can never, ever bury. Before we continue, make sure you hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because this tale is about to travel across hearts, across time, and across oceans. So sit back, grab your popcorn, and let's begin the story. Our story begins in the beating, chaotic, and beautiful heart of Lagos, Nigeria. Meet Grace Okoro. Grace is 24 years old. She has a smile that could calm a storm and hands that are skilled, gentle, and sure. She is a nurse, and not just any nurse. She is one of the best, a recent graduate who poured every single ounce of her soul into her training. For Grace, nursing wasn't just a job, it was a calling, a way to fight back against the darkness she had seen in the world. In a city of 20 million souls, she wanted to be one who mended, one who healed. But Lagos is an expensive city. Her father's pension was a distant, faded memory, and her mother's small shop barely kept the lights on in their humble apartment. Grace's dream was simple: to earn enough to give her parents a comfortable life, enough to fix the leaking roof, enough to finally tell her mother to rest. So when the offer came, it felt like a miracle, a private nursing position. The salary was unbelievable, more money than she had ever dreamed of holding, enough to solve all her family's problems and then some. There was only one catch: the patient. His name was Chief Arthur Williams. Chief Arthur Williams wasn't just rich, he was an institution, a legend. At 85 years old, he was a ghost from the old world of Nigerian power and money. His face was a fixture on magazine covers, the titan of African industry. Williams Group seals trillion-naira deal. They called him the mysterious mogul of Ikoyi. He had built an empire from dust, a sprawling network of shipping, real estate, and technology with tentacles in every corner of the continent. But all empires eventually fade, all titans must fall. Chief Williams was dying. A rare, aggressive disease was slowly turning his body into a prison. He was now confined to his legendary mansion in Ikoyi, a fortress of solitude hidden from the world behind high walls and towering palm trees. The agency that hired Grace was very clear. This job was not for the faint of heart. Chief Williams had been through a dozen nurses in the last 6 months alone. He was difficult, demanding, some even whispered that he was a monster. But Grace wasn't afraid of a difficult patient. She was afraid of poverty. She was afraid of watching her parents struggle. So she said yes. The day she arrived, the Lagos sun was fierce, but the moment she stepped through the gigantic black iron gates of the Williams estate, the air turned cold. The constant noise of the city vanished completely, replaced by an unnerving, heavy silence. The driveway was lined with trees so perfectly manicured they didn't look real. The ground wasn't soil, but a sea of white gravel that crunched under her sensible shoes with a sound like breaking bones. The house, it wasn't a house. It was a monument to wealth, a gleaming white palace of glass and marble that seemed to watch her with 1,000 unseen eyes. At the colossal front door, she was not met with a smile. She was met by a man in a sharp, tailored suit. He was handsome in a severe sort of way, with eyes that held the same coldness as the marble floors. "You must be the new one," he said. His voice was smooth but laced with something sharp. "I am David Williams, the chief's son." Grace nodded, her own voice barely a whisper. "Grace Okoro, it's a pleasure to meet you, sir." David did not return the pleasantry. He turned and led her inside, his expensive shoes clicking with authority on the polished floor. "Let me be clear, Miss Okoro," he began, his voice echoing in the cavernous hall. "Your job is to administer medication, to monitor his vitals, to ensure his comfort. You are not his friend, you are not his confidant, you are staff." He stopped and turned to face her, his eyes like chips of ice. "My father is the head of an empire. Even in his current state, his mind is his most valuable asset. You will not engage him in unnecessary conversation. You will report everything, and I mean everything, directly to me or to Mrs. Adebio, the head housekeeper. Is that understood? A knot tightened in Grace's stomach. This wasn't a home. It was a gilded cage, and David was one of the wardens. Yes, sir, she managed to say, her professionalism a fragile shield against his hostility. Just then, a stern-looking older woman in a formal grey dress appeared as if from nowhere. This was Mrs. Adebio. She had been with the family for 40 years and moved through the mansion with the quiet efficiency of a shadow. Her face was a mask of polite indifference, but her eyes missed nothing. Mrs. Adebio will show you to my father's wing, David said, dismissing Grace with a wave of his hand. Remember what I said. Mrs. Adebio gave Grace a small, almost imperceptible nod, and began to walk down a long, sun-drenched corridor. The walls were lined with art that probably cost more than Grace's entire neighborhood. The chief's wing is isolated from the rest of the house, the housekeeper explained, her voice low and crisp. He prefers the quiet. The silence was so profound, so heavy it felt like a presence in the room. It was the silence of a tomb. They reached a set of grand double doors. Mrs. Adebio paused, placing a hand on the handle. She looked at Grace, and for a fleeting moment, Grace saw a crack in her stoic facade, a flicker of something that looked like pity. He will test you, she said softly. Don't let him break you. And with that, she opened the door. The room was vast. One entire wall was a sheet of glass looking out onto a stunning, private garden. In the center of the room, surrounded by a constellation of medical machines that beeped and whirred softly, was a large, imposing bed. And in that bed was a man. He was impossibly frail, a small, shrunken figure lost in a sea of white sheets. The powerful titan from the magazine covers was gone, replaced by a skeleton draped in paper-thin skin. His breathing was shallow, his eyes were closed. Grace's heart went out to him. This wasn't a monster. This was a sick old man, alone in a cold, silent room. All the fear and intimidation she felt from David melted away, replaced by the familiar warmth of her calling. She walked quietly to the bedside. The beeping of the machines was the only sound. She checked his chart, her movements calm and professional. She prepared his medication, her hands steady. As she leaned over to adjust his pillow, his eyes snapped open. Grace flinched, startled. They were not dull or clouded. They were piercingly sharp, intelligent, and full of a fire that his body could no longer contain. His voice, when it came, was a dry, rasping whisper, a ghost of the powerful baritone he once had. Another one, he rasped, his eyes boring into hers. They send children now. How long do you think you will last? Grace swallowed, composing herself. I am not planning on leaving, Chief, she said, her voice gentle but firm. I am here to take care of you. A dry, rattling sound escaped his lips. It might have been a laugh. Take care of me, he whispered, or take care of my son's inheritance. Tell me, child, what do you really want? Grace looked him straight in the eye. I want to do my job, sir, and I want to help you feel more comfortable. He stared at her for a long, silent moment. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. He was studying her, dissecting her, looking for the greed, the fear, the weakness he had found in all the others. Finally, he closed his eyes, a flicker of something unreadable in his expression. We shall see, he whispered, and then he was silent. The days that followed were a test of endurance. Chief Williams was exactly as David had described. He was demanding, irritable, and cynical. He refused medications. He insulted her professionalism. He tried to get a rise out of her, to find a crack in her calm exterior. But Grace did not crack. She met his anger with patience, his insults with quiet dignity, his despair with a steady, reassuring presence. She talked to him not as a patient, but as a person, telling him about the noisy Lagos streets he could no longer see, the taste of the roasted corn from the vendor on her corner. Most of the time, he just grunted or ignored her. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to shift. He started taking his medication without a fight. He would listen, his eyes closed, as she spoke. A fragile, unspoken truce began to form between them in the quiet of that room. Then, one rainy afternoon, about a month into her employment, everything changed. Grace was reading a novel in a chair by the window as the chief slept. Suddenly his voice, stronger than she had ever heard it, cut through the silence. Grace, She looked up startled. He had never used her name before. His eyes were wide open, and they were filled with a desperate urgency. "Come here," he commanded. She rushed to his bedside. "Chief, are you all right? Are you in pain?" He shook his head, a small, weak movement. "No, no pain." He took a shuddering breath. "I have a request, a final wish, something no one else can do, not my son, not my lawyers." He paused, his eyes searching hers, looking for something he had been seeking all this time. "Everyone thinks my last wish is about my money, my company," he whispered, his voice trembling with a strange energy. "They think they know what I want, to secure my legacy." He took her hand, his own as cold as ice and light as a bird's wing. His grip, though weak, was firm. "But they are all wronged." He locked his gaze on her, and in his eyes Grace saw not a dying man but a king with one last, secret command. "The question is, Grace," he whispered, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush that chilled her to the bone. "Are you different? What is the billionaire's final wish? What secret has he guarded so closely, a secret he couldn't even trust his own son with? The answer would not only change Grace's life forever, it would threaten to burn the entire Williams empire to the ground. The story is just beginning." The words, a dry whisper from the dying billionaire, hung in the cold, silent room. They were heavier than any sound Grace had ever heard. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor seemed to be counting down the seconds of her old life, a life that was about to end right here, in this room. Her hand was still in his. His skin was like paper, but his grip was a steel trap forged by desperation. His eyes, those piercing, intelligent eyes, were locked on hers, demanding an answer. He wasn't just asking a question, he was passing a judgment. Grace's mind raced. What did he mean, different? Different from the other nurses who had fled. Different from his own son, David, who patrolled the halls like a predator. Different from everyone else who saw him as a vault of money waiting to be opened. Her throat was dry. She looked at this frail man, this fallen titan, and for the first time she didn't see a patient. She saw a man drowning, and he was asking if she was strong enough to pull him to shore. I don't know, Chief," she answered honestly, her voice trembling slightly. "I try to be." A faint, sad smile touched the old man's lips. It was the first real smile she had ever seen from him. It transformed his face, showing a ghost of the man he once was. "Honesty," he rasped. "A rare commodity in this house, it will have to do." He released her hand and gestured weakly toward the bedside table. "My drawer, open it." Grace hesitated for a second, her heart pounding. This was it. She was crossing a line. David's cold voice echoed in her head. "You are not his confidant. You will report everything." But the plea in the old man's eyes was stronger. She slid open the heavy mahogany drawer. Inside, among vials of medicine and sterile wipes, was a small dark object. It was a wooden bird carved by hand. It was old, the wood worn smooth in places from years of being held. It was simple, almost crude, not the kind of thing you would expect a billionaire to own. It had no jewels, no gold, just the dark, polished wood. "Take it," Chief Williams commanded, his voice urgent. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the bird. It was light and warm to the touch, as if it held a faint, lingering heat. 30 years ago, the chief began, his eyes looking past Grace into a memory she could not see. There was a woman, her name was Esther. He said the name as if it were a prayer, as if the word itself was sacred. "She was not a woman of society, she was not rich, she was everything. I made a promise to her, a promise I was forced to break." His voice cracked, thick with a pain that was far older and deeper than his disease. "My ambition, my family, my weakness. I chose this empire over her, and I have lived with the silence of that choice every single day." He took a ragged breath, the effort costing him. "I am paying the price for my life, Grace, but I will not meet my maker with this debt still on my soul." He focused on her again, his gaze intense. "I need you to find her." Grace stared at him, the small wooden bird feeling like a lead weight in her palm. "Find her? Chief, Lagos is a massive city. How? Where would I even begin to look?" "She was a carver," he whispered, gesturing to the bird. "She made this for me. We used to meet in a small workshop she had near the Oberlend Bridge. It was a long time ago. The place is probably gone now." He coughed, a deep, rattling sound that shook his entire frame. Grace instinctively moved to help him, but he waved her away. "No, listen," he insisted. "I don't know where she is now, she may not even be in Lagos, she may not be alive, but you must try." He looked at the bird in her hand. That is the key. She told me once she carved her heart into it. What am I supposed to do if I find her? Grace asked, her mind reeling. This was insane. It was a task for a private investigator, not a nurse. Give her the bird, he said simply. And give her a message. He leaned closer, his voice dropping so low she had to lean in to hear him. He told her the message, a few simple, devastating words meant only for Esther. And then he gave her the final part of the instructions. In my personal safe there is an envelope with your name on it. Mrs. Adebio knows the combination. When the time comes, she will give it to you. It contains enough money to change your life and another set of instructions for Esther. My son, David, knows nothing about it. He must never know. The warning in his voice was chilling. He is a good son in his way. He protects the empire, but he protects it from everything, even from my past. He will see you as a threat. He will see her as a threat. You must be careful, Grace. Trust no one in this house, not even the shadows on the wall. He sank back into the pillows, exhausted, his eyes closed. Now go before someone comes. Grace stood there for a long moment, frozen. The wooden bird was a secret brand in her palm. She had a choice. She could put it back in the drawer, pretend this conversation never happened, and continue being just a nurse. It was the safe choice, the sensible choice. Or she could take on this impossible task, a quest for a ghost on behalf of a dying king in a house full of enemies. She thought of her mother's tired hands, of the leaking roof, of the promise of a changed life. But more than that, she thought of the raw, desperate pain in the old man's eyes. He wasn't asking her to fetch water. He was asking her to deliver his soul. Slowly, she curled her fingers around the wooden bird and slipped it into the deep pocket of her uniform. She checked his vitals, her hands moving on autopilot. Her mind was a whirlwind. As she left the room, closing the double doors quietly behind her, she felt as if she had aged 10 years. The silent, art-filled corridor no longer looked beautiful, it looked menacing. Every shadow seemed to hide a pair of watching eyes. She needed to get back to her small staff quarters to think, to examine the bird. But as she rounded a corner, she almost collided with a hard chest. It was David. He stood there perfectly still, his arms crossed. He hadn't been walking, he had been waiting for her. You were in there a long time, he said. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. His cold eyes swept over her from her face down to her shoes and back up again. He was searching for something. The chief was restless, Grace replied, trying to keep her voice steady, professional. I was just making him comfortable. Comfortable, David repeated, the word tasting like poison in his mouth. My father hasn't been comfortable in a year. What were you really talking about? We were not talking, sir, Grace lied, her heart hammering against her ribs. I was reading to him until he fell asleep. David took a step closer, invading her personal space. He was tall and she had to look up at him. He smelled of expensive cologne and faint, simmering rage. Let me tell you something about my father, Nurse Okoro, he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He is a master manipulator. It is how he built his empire. He sees people's weaknesses and he uses them. He will see your situation, your ambition, and he will use it. He will make you promises. He will offer you the world. Do not be foolish enough to believe him. Grace stood her ground, looking him in the eye. My only ambition is to do my job, Mr. Williams. A humorless smile played on David's lips. Is it? He whispered. He held her gaze for a few more seconds, a silent battle of wills. Then he stepped back, creating a space between them once more. See that you do, he said, his voice returning to its icy calm. Because if I find out that you are trying to take advantage of my father's condition, I will not just have you fired. I will make sure you never work as a nurse in this country again. I will ruin you. Do we have an understanding? The threat was not veiled. It was a promise, as real and as solid as the marble floor beneath their feet. Yes, sir, Grace said, her voice barely audible. Perfectly. He gave her one last, lingering look of suspicion, then turned and walked away, his sharp footsteps echoing down the long, empty hall. Grace leaned against the wall, her legs suddenly weak. She could feel the wooden bird in her pocket, a dangerous weight. It wasn't just a secret anymore. It was a declaration of war, and she was standing alone in the middle of the battlefield. What had she just done? She had lied to David. She had agreed to a secret mission. She was now a conspirator. She hurried to her room, locked the door, and finally, with trembling hands, took out the wooden bird. She sat on her small bed, the opulence of the mansion feeling 1,000,000 miles away. She turned the bird over and over, It was beautifully made but simple. What was the key? What did he mean? She carved her heart into it. She ran her thumb along the smooth wood, feeling for any imperfection, any hidden switch or compartment. She examined the wings, the tail, the small, carved eyes. Nothing. It was just a solid piece of wood. Frustration and fear began to set in. Was the old man delirious? Was this all a wild goose chase? Her thumb pressed down hard on the base of the bird, where it would have been attached to a stand, and she felt it. A tiny, almost imperceptible click. She pressed again, harder this time. A tiny section of the base popped open. It wasn't a compartment, it was a cover, and beneath it, burned carefully into the wood in tiny, elegant letters, were not a name or an address. It was a single word. A word that made no sense to her at all. A word that opened a dozen new questions, and plunged her even deeper into the heart of the billionaire's last secret. It was a single word. Sunbird. Grace stared at the word, her mind racing. Sunbird, what did it mean? It wasn't a name, it wasn't an address. Was it a code? A nickname? A place? The old chief had said Esther was a carver, that she had carved her heart into the bird. This word was the first beat of that heart. This was her first clue, her only clue. A single word to unravel a 30-year-old mystery in a city of 20 million people. The task felt impossible, but for the first time since she took this job, Grace felt a flicker of hope. This was real. The old man wasn't delirious. There was a path, and she was standing at the beginning of it. But David's chilling threat echoed in her mind. I will ruin you. She was a nurse, not a spy. How could she possibly investigate this without being caught? Every move she made in this house was watched. That night, sleep was a stranger. With the door locked and a chair wedged under the handle, Grace sat on her bed, the lamp casting a small circle of light. The wooden bird sat in her lap and her phone was in her hand. Her investigation began the only way it could, quietly, digitally, in the dead of night. She typed sunbird into the search bar. The results were useless. Thousands of pages about a species of bird found across Africa and Asia, pictures of iridescent feathers and long, curved beaks. She added the word Lagos, more of the same, birdwatching tour, nature preserves, nothing. Frustration began to creep in. She tried different combinations. Sunbird Esther, Sunbird Carver, Obelend Carver 1990s, page after page of dead ends. The digital world was vast, but a secret from 30 years ago was a ghost in the machine. Hours passed. The city outside grew quiet. The only sound was the frantic tapping of her own fingers. She felt a wave of despair wash over her. Maybe David was right. Maybe the old man was just a manipulator, sending her on a fool's errand for his own cruel amusement. She was about to give up, to put the bird away and try to forget the whole impossible affair. But then she thought of the look in his eyes. The raw, ancient pain. It wasn't a game. It was a dying man's final confession. She took a deep breath and tried one last time, thinking differently. This wasn't about a person named Sunbird. It was about art, an identity. She typed in a new search query, Lagos Artisan Collective's 1990s wood carving. She scrolled through obscure forums, old university archives, digital copies of forgotten newspapers, and then she found it. It was a small, grainy article from a defunct arts and culture magazine, dated 1992. The headline read, The Soul of Wood, Obelend's Fadding Carver Community. Her heart hammered in her chest. The article spoke of a vibrant group of artists who had workshops under the shadow of the Obelend Bridge, creating sculptures from teak and mahogany. It lamented how development and changing tastes were pushing them out. The journalist mentioned several artists by name, and then in the final paragraph was the sentence that made her gasp. Among the most promising of the new generation is a quiet, prodigiously talented woman known only by the name of her signature creation, the Sunbird Carver, so called for the unique, hopeful birds she brings to life from simple blocks of wood. The Sunbird Carver, it was her, Esther. The article didn't give her real name, it didn't give an address, but it gave her a lead, a tangible starting point. The Obelend Bridge, she had to go there. But how? She couldn't just leave. Her life was a strict, monitored routine. Breakfast, Chief Williams's wing; lunch, Chief Williams's wing; dinner, her room. Any deviation would raise alarms. David would know. Mrs. Adebio would know. She needed a day off. The next morning she knew she had to face the dragon. Not David, but the quieter, more observant gatekeeper, Mrs. Adebio. She found the head housekeeper overseeing the polishing of silverware in the grand dining room, a task she performed with the focus of a surgeon. Mrs. Adebio, Grace began, her voice betraying a nervousness she couldn't hide. The older woman didn't look up immediately. She finished polishing a fork, held it up to the light to inspect it, and only then did she turn her cool, assessing gaze on Grace. "Yes, Miss Okoro. I was hoping I might be able to request a personal day. Tomorrow, if possible. There is a family matter I need to attend to." The lie felt clumsy on her tongue. Mrs. Adebio's expression didn't change, but Grace felt as though she were being x-rayed. "A family matter? Is everything all right with your parents?" Her tone was polite, but the question was sharp. "Yes, they are fine, thank you. It is a cousin's child's naming ceremony. It came up suddenly." The housekeeper was silent for a long moment, her eyes never leaving Grace's face. She was weighing the lie, testing its strength. Grace could feel the sweat on her palms. "The chief has been more stable since you arrived," Mrs. Adebio said finally, an unexpected compliment that felt more like a warning. "He is comfortable with you. It is not ideal to disrupt his routine." "I know," Grace said quickly, "and I am so sorry for the inconvenience. It is very important, I would not ask otherwise." Mrs. Adebio let out a slow, quiet sigh. "Very well. David will not be pleased, but I will handle it. You may have the day, but be back before sundown. The chief gets agitated in the evenings." "Thank you, Mrs. Adebio. Thank you so much." Grace felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost made her dizzy. "Just be sure your family matter is truly what you say it is, Miss Okoro," the housekeeper added, her voice dropping a fraction. "This house does not like surprises." The next day, Grace left the cold, sterile silence of the Williams estate and plunged back into the vibrant chaos of Lagos. She felt like a prisoner on a day pass. She took a Danfo bus, the loud music and the press of bodies a welcome shock to her system. She was anonymous again, just another face in the crowd. She got off near Oberlend. The area had changed dramatically since the 1990s. Gleaming new buildings stood beside crumbling old ones. The bridge roared with traffic overhead. She walked the streets, searching for any sign of the old artisan community the article had described. She asked shopkeepers, street vendors, and old men sitting on plastic chairs, "Do you remember a place where people carved wood, a long time ago?" Most shook their heads, too young to remember or too busy to care. But then an old man selling roasted plantain pointed a wrinkled finger down a narrow, crowded alley. "There were wood sellers down there, long ago, before the new market was built. Nothing there now but mechanics and dust." Grace's heart sank, but she had to see for herself. She navigated the alley, the air thick with the smell of engine oil and exhaust fumes. The man was right. It was a graveyard of broken-down cars and spare parts. There were no artists here, no sunbird carver. It was another dead end. Defeated, she was about to turn back when she saw it. Tucked away, almost completely obscured by a stack of old tires, was a faded, painted sign on a crumbling wall. Most of the letters were gone, but she could just make out a few shapes. An A, an R, a T. It was the last ghost of the old community. She knew asking around here was useless. She needed official records, names, addresses. The article was her lead, but it was just a story. She needed data. And there was only one place in Lagos to find that kind of information from 30 years ago. The National Archives. It was a long journey to the Archives building, a formidable colonial-era structure that looked as though it held the city's every secret. Inside, it was quiet and smelled of old paper and dust. She felt a new surge of hope. This was it. If a business named Sunbird Arts was ever officially registered, it would be here. After filling out a series of forms, a clerk pointed her toward a dim, dusty room filled with heavy, leather-bound books. They were old business directories, organized by year. She found the shelf for the early 1990s and pulled out the directory for 1992. The book was heavy, its pages yellow and fragile. She carried it to a long wooden table and began to scan the pages, her finger tracing the tiny print. Her time was running out. She had to be back at the mansion before dark. She searched under arts, crafts, carving. Nothing. Her hope began to drain away again. Maybe the business was never officially registered. Maybe Esther was just an informal artist lost to time. Then she had an idea. She went back to the start and began scanning the section. And there it was. Halfway down a page, nestled between a shipping company and a surveyor's office, was the entry she had been praying for. Sunbird Arts and Crafts, proprietor E. Ademi, address 14B Alakaja Street, Festac Town. Adami, Esther Adami, it had to be her. Grace felt a jolt of pure adrenaline. She had a name, a full name, and an address. It was old, but it was a concrete place, Festac Town. She pulled out a small notepad and a pen from her bag, her hand shaking with excitement as she began to write down the address. This was the key. This could change everything. Looking for something, Miss Okoro. The voice was quiet, calm, and directly behind her. It cut through the silence of the archive like a shard of glass. Grace froze, her pen hovering over the paper. Her blood ran cold. She knew that voice. She had heard it just yesterday in the dining room. Slowly, she turned. Standing there, her hands clasped behind her back, with an expression that was utterly unreadable, was Mrs. Adebio. Mrs. Adebio stood there, a silent grey sentinel. She wasn't dressed in her usual formal housekeeper's uniform. She wore a simple wrapper and blouse, the clothes of a woman running errands, blending into the city. It was a perfect disguise. There was no surprise in her eyes, no shock, only a calm, unnerving certainty. She hadn't stumbled upon Grace by accident. She had followed her. Grace's mind went into overdrive. The lie about the naming ceremony crumbled into dust. The bus ride, her search in Oberlin, her journey here, every step had been shadowed. David's threat was a loud roar, but Mrs. Adebio's quiet surveillance was infinitely more terrifying. Mrs. Adebio, Grace stammered, her hand instinctively trying to cover the address she had just found. What are you doing here? The housekeeper's eyes flickered down to the open book, then back to Grace's face. She ignored the question. I believe I told you that this house does not like surprises, Miss Okoro, and you, it seems, are full of them. Her voice was still low, still crisp, but it had lost its professional veneer. Now it was personal. Your cousin's naming ceremony appears to be a very dusty affair, Mrs. Adebio continued, gesturing at the rows of old books. I was worried about you. David was insistent that your day off was a bad idea. He asked me to keep an eye on things, to make sure you returned on time. The lie was so smooth, so plausible, but Grace knew better. This wasn't about her schedule. This was about the secret. Mrs. Adebio knew, or she suspected. I was just doing some research, Grace said, her voice weak, for a personal project. I see, Mrs. Adebio said, taking a step closer. She looked down at the open directory, her sharp eyes scanning the page. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs. She was caught. It was over. David would hear of this, and his promise to ruin her would be fulfilled before the sun went down. But the housekeeper's gaze didn't stop on the section. It continued to scan, then she looked up at Grace, her face an unreadable mask. I hope you find what you are looking for, she said, her tone shifting slightly. It was softer, laced with something Grace couldn't identify. Was it pity, or a warning? It is getting late, we should be heading back, the traffic will be bad. Grace was stunned into silence. She wasn't being dragged to David. She wasn't being fired on the spot. It was a reprieve, a terrifying, confusing reprieve. Why was Mrs. Adebio letting this go? Grace quickly scribbled down the address, 14B Alakaja Street, Festac Town, on her notepad, snapped the heavy book shut and returned it to the shelf, her movements stiff and jerky. Her mind was a mess of fear and confusion. The journey back to the Ikoyi mansion was the longest of Grace's life. They sat in the back of a taxi, the chaotic sounds of Lagos rushing past the windows. Neither of them spoke a word. The silence was thick with unspoken questions. Grace could feel the housekeeper's presence beside her, a constant heavy pressure. She clutched the notepad in her bag like a talisman, the address a burning secret. When they arrived back at the estate, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. As they walked up the gravel driveway, Mrs. Adebio finally broke the silence. A word of advice, Miss Okoro, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Whatever it is you are doing, stop. Some doors are left closed for a reason. Trying to open them will only get you hurt, and it will hurt the chief. They entered the grand, cold house. David was nowhere to be seen. Grace's heart was still pounding. She expected to be summoned, to be interrogated, but nothing happened. She went to her room, the silence of the mansion more ominous than ever. Later that evening, as Grace was preparing Chief Williams's nightly medication, he stirred. His eyes opened, and they were clear and focused. Did you find anything? He rasped, the question urgent, desperate. Grace hesitated, remembering Mrs. Adebio's warning. But looking at the old man's face, at the hope warring with decades of pain, she couldn't lie to him. She leaned in close. Yes, she whispered. I found a name, Esther Adami, and an old address in Festac Town. A shudder went through the chief's frail body. A single tear escaped his eye and traced a path through the wrinkled landscape of his cheek. He had not heard that name spoken aloud in 30 years. Esther Adami, he repeated, the name a ghost on his lips. She is real, you found her. But what does this revelation mean? How will Grace find her? And what secrets will come to light when past and present collide? Don't miss part 2. Hit subscribe now so you're first to uncover the next chapter of this incredible story. Comment below your thoughts. Who do you think Esther is and what will happen next? Your guess might just be closer than you think.